Ernesto Laclau and Chantal Mouffe wrote their book Hegemony and Socialist Strategy in 1985. This is a time when class compromise after World War II had resulted in the construction of welfare states in Western democracies, living conditions for many people had vastly improved, and following the counterculture hippie movement of the 1960s, numerous so-called new social movements had arisen addressing issues of inequality in realms other than class, such as the civil rights, feminist and environmental movements. The early 1980s marks the moment when this unprecedented economic growth and expansion of welfare states in Western democracies begins to slow down, and right-wing neoliberal politics begins to regain its strength. So in this historical context, Laclau and Mouffe set out to evaluate where Marxism went wrong and what the left can do to remobilize. Their work is one of the first in post-Marxist political theory, and it's significant for two reasons. First, it critically re-examines Marxist theory and it points out a number of foundational flaws in Marx's reasoning. Secondly, it develops positive alternatives for the left and other social movements to remobilize and generate change. So, writing over 100 years after Marx, Laclau and Mouffe ask why Marxism has failed to achieve its goals and propose a way ahead for the left. Marxism predicted that capitalism would over time inevitably result in a working-class revolution. Yet, 100 years after Marx, this did not occur in most capitalist countries. Why? Laclau and Mouffe build on Gramsci's theory of cultural hegemony to explain how elites can maintain power, not only through coercion or economic force, but also through ideology. When the values and norms propagated by elites become accepted by citizens as common sense, ideology provides legitimacy for those in power, and so it helps to maintain the status quo. Laclau and Mouffe expand on Gramsci's theorizing to suggest ways in which the left can construct and propagate their own hegemonic discourse in order to achieve social change. Their work has been and still is very influential in post-Marxist and post-colonial theory and in research on social movements. Hegemony and Radical Democracy provides three core theoretical or conceptual contributions to the study of politics and international relations. The first is that social change is not deterministic. The second is that social change can involve a plurality of actors. And the third is that social change requires a discourse that enables activists to frame power inequality as oppression. So to start with the first, social change is not deterministic. Contrary to Marxism, Laclau and Mouffe argue that social change or revolution is not inevitable. It does not necessarily happen at privileged points in time, and it does not necessarily go in the right direction. So whereas Marx presented as an inevitable historical outcome of capitalism its demise in the form of popular revolution, Laclau and Mouffe posit that there's nothing inevitable in struggles against power. As they say, there is therefore nothing inevitable or natural in the different struggles against power, and it is necessary to explain in each case the reasons for their emergence and the different modulations they may adopt. So that the outcomes of power struggles are indeterminate, therefore means we need to explain when, why and how social change is successful, and when, why and how it is not. So for example, we need to understand why feminist, civil rights and environmental movements are successful at some points in time but not in others, and we also need to understand reversals of social change and non-change. The second is that social change can involve a plurality of social actors. So again, contrary to Marxism, Laclau and Mouffe argue that there is not a single privileged actor, such as the working class, that will bring about social change. They argue that with increasing social complexity, an antagonism based purely on class will not be sufficient to mobilize enough citizens to generate social change, and hence they propose a more pluralist approach to politics. Which brings me to their third contribution, which is that social change requires a discourse that enables activists to frame power inequality as oppression. This really is Laclau and Mouffe's core contribution, and it consists of two steps. The first step is that Laclau and Mouffe argue that creating antagonism helps to achieve social change because it helps to mobilize people. But increasing social complexity during and after the Industrial Revolution means that it is the construction of such an antagonism that becomes the crucial problem of politics. Because there is now such diversity of social groups, they can no longer be easily divided in two opposing camps, such as the bourgeoisie and the proletariat. And hence the challenge for those seeking to achieve social change becomes to find a story that constructs a new antagonism that is capable of mobilizing multiple social groups under one umbrella. Secondly, Laclau and Mouffe argue that in order for such a story to have the capacity to actually mobilize people, it needs to also construct the antagonism as constituting an inequality of power, subordination as they call it, and as constituting an unjust inequality of power, which is then oppression. So in order to argue for the antagonism to be unjust, so as to frame subordination as oppression, the story needs to connect to a broader, already existing hegemonic discourse. For example, inequality of power between men and women has for the most part of history not been considered unjust. It is only when the idea emerges that all humans are equal that a struggle for gender equality, and for that matter struggles for race, age, sexual, etc. equality, becomes possible. So you need the larger story in order to frame your own story as a struggle. This is where what Laclau and Mouffe call the democratic revolution reveals its importance. In order to be mobilized in this way, the democratic principle of liberty and equality first had to impose itself as the new matrix of the social imaginary. And when it did, it unleashed a dazzling variety of new claims to equality by a multitude of social groups, ranging from the civil rights movement to feminism to more recently Occupy and the Indignados. Therefore, the central problem that Laclau and Mouffe analyze in this last chapter of their book is to identify the discursive conditions for the emergence of a collective action directed towards struggling against inequalities and challenging relations of subordination, and to identify the conditions in which a relation of subordination becomes a relation of oppression and thereby constitutes itself into the site of an antagonism. So, hegemony and radical democracy provide at least 4 hypotheses about the conditions under which social movements can be successful in achieving political change. The first one is the power of hegemonic discourse. Laclau and Mouffe suggest that social movements that are successful in constructing an antagonism that highlights power inequality between social groups subsequently link it to a pre-existing and accepted discourse that argues why this power inequality is unjust, and use that to mobilize support for social change are more likely to successfully achieve social change. The second hypothesis is the need to be agile. Laclau and Mouffe describe how the democratic imaginary of equality shifted from socioeconomic classes to new areas of power inequality with the new social movements of the 1960s and the 1970s. This is really a beautiful illustration that democracy is a moving target. As social reality changes, new power inequalities emerge, and new activist movements will seek to achieve social change to address these inequalities. Therefore, social movements that are agile and that are able to adapt to changing social realities are more likely to be successful. The third hypothesis is the need to collaborate, or to work with social diversity. Laclau and Mouffe's main critique vis-à-vis the left is its excessive focus on socioeconomic class as a strategy to mobilize citizens for social change, which they argue is doomed to fail. Their argument that the plurality of the social is a basic fact in modern industrial societies implies that social movements that narrowly focus on a single target social group are much less likely to be successful in achieving social change than social movements that manage to bring together multiple diverse social groups, construct a common story that unites these groups, and sets goals for them to achieve collectively that does justice to their internal diversity. Finally, the fourth hypothesis is to provide viable alternatives. Laclau and Mouffe also note if the demands of a subordinated group are presented purely as negative demands, subversive of a certain order, without being linked to any viable project for the reconstruction of specific areas of society, Their capacity to act hegemonically will be excluded from the outset. This implies, very simply, that social movements that are able to sketch a concrete imaginary of what an alternative society looks like are likely to be more successful in achieving social change. Apart from the ideas that we discussed before, there are two ideas in the text that are interesting to consider when thinking about questions of power, order, and justice, or at least that very much speak to me. The first is that the center of democracy is empty. This idea constitutes the core of radical democracy. The idea is that if one takes seriously as a core principle of democracy that everyone is equal, it also means that no one has a privileged claim to truth. In other words, the left does not have a privileged position or a right to claim that their discursive construction of social reality is more true than alternative discourses. In other words, the center of democracy is empty, or as Laclau and Mouffe say, the site of power becomes an empty space. Now, Laclau and Mouffe acknowledge the uneasiness that this radical indeterminacy of democracy can create, but they emphasize that recognizing plurality and equality in plurality is essential for democracy to function. So, they say, for the defense of the interests of the workers, not to be made at the expense of the rights of women, immigrants or consumers, it is necessary to establish an equivalence between these different struggles. It is only on this condition that struggles against power become truly democratic, and that the demanding of rights is not carried out on the basis of an individualistic problematic, but in the context of respect for the rights to equality of other subordinated groups. The second idea that speaks to me in radical democracy is who decides what is just and unjust, or legitimate and illegitimate inequality of power. Laclau and Mouffe distinguish relationships of unequal power in which both participants don't question the power imbalance, which is what they call subjugation, from relationships on unequal power where participants question these relationships, which is what they call oppression. From, a third distinction, relationships of unequal power where external actors to the relationship question the relationship, which they refer to as domination. This threefold distinction is very helpful in distinguishing legitimate or just imbalances of power from illegitimate or unjust imbalances of power, and in questioning who decides what oppression is. So regarding the first, the distinction between subjugation and oppression is important. There are many areas in life in which we accept unequal power relationships, such as your supervisor at work, parents and children, etc. That doesn't mean that we are unequal as human beings, but that in that particular social configuration we accept the unequal power relationship as having some degree of justification or legitimacy. We also have norms about what is appropriate and inappropriate use of power in these relationships. So, for example, we find it acceptable that parents forbid small children to be out on the street at night. We don't find it acceptable that parents hit their children. Likewise, we find it acceptable that our supervisor at work assigns us work tasks, but we don't find it acceptable that our supervisor tells us who to vote for. Of course, and here's the crucial point, these norms change over time and they are different in different cultures, again highlighting that what constitutes oppression is not fixed. Secondly, these distinctions also help us question who gets to decide what constitutes just legitimate or unjust illegitimate imbalances of power. Returning to the example of the employer-employee relationship, viewed from the outside, external actors may still view this relationship as domination, even if the actors involved may be all right with it. If a social movement subsequently develops a discourse that frames this relationship as oppression, this can lead the actors involved to start questioning the relationship and subsequently feel oppressed by it and seek to change it. So a large part of the work of the new social movements has been to frame a story in which relationships of subjugation, hitherto perceived as legitimate, became questioned so that the people involved also push for change. The civil rights movement and feminist movements are a good example of this. But it also poses an interesting moral question. To what extent does one have the right to convince other people that they are in a relationship of oppression.